Well, that was just about as entertaining a brand of baseball as you probably could have had, and unfortunately, one of us is happier than the other. But there was a lot of good baseball to be had at Camden Yards for the last 3 days. We are going to take you through it here on this Locked On crossover between Locked On Reds and Locked On Orioles. I'm your host, Jeff Carr, alongside Connor Newcomb, and he got the chance to be at the ballpark on Wednesday night. A lot of great stuff going on. He has a great segment in his Wednesday episode where he talks about Pride Night and what it meant for the game and the awesome atmosphere that was. You definitely want to go check that out. But we have both been long-suffering fans of two teams that really don't ever seem to stop rebuilding. However, we might be seeing the light at the end of the tunnel for both squads. And Connor had a very interesting thought on Twitter on the final game of this series, which is one of the main drivers for this crossover. Plus, I want to look back at an interesting game the last time that the Reds and Orioles faced each other in Camden Yards. Thanks so much for joining us here on this Locked On crossover. And Connor, kind of like I said, the stark similarities that you see and that I see between the 2023 Reds and the 2023 Orioles or 2022 Orioles, sorry, are just so pronounced.
Yeah, I mean, big thing is ahead of schedule, right? Like that's where the Orioles were last year, was ahead of schedule. And I think what the O's are doing this year, they're also a little ahead of schedule just with how good they've been. But most people thought, okay, 2023 will be the year the Orioles play competitive baseball again. I don't think we thought it would be this competitive, like competing for the AL East competitive, but good baseball. Last year, thought they were going to be still bad. And I think the same thing happened for the Reds coming into this year. I mean, they knew that young talent was coming up. Same with last year. We knew Adley Rutschman was coming to the bigs. We didn't know he was going to make that much of a difference. This year, I think most people knew Matt McLain, Ellie De La Cruz, and company would be in the big leagues this year, but didn't know how much of a difference it would make. And it's been fun to see. I think the easiest comparison is that. And the other thing is a 10-plus game winning streak in the middle of the season that kind of catapults you into relevancy. The Orioles had a 10-game winning streak kind of from end of June through early July last year. Reds did it a little bit earlier, but a 12-game winning streak that took them from, hey, the Reds are playing a little bit better this year to, wow, they're over 500 and in a playoff spot. That's exactly what the O's winning streak did. They were about 7 or 8 games under. It took them over 500. It took them into the wild card race, and that's where they stayed the rest of the year.
Yeah, that's something that really kind of boggles my mind a little bit because you're right. The Orioles were such a huge surprise last season, and the Reds are this year. Look, I was saying before the season started that the Reds would win 75 games. And I had a friend bet me Jeff Ruby's dinner based on that win total. He's saying that they would win less, obviously. Looks pretty certain that they're at least going to hover around 500, and I think they've definitely got a shot to win this division. That was probably the only difference between the Reds and the Orioles is that the Orioles happen to play in just the buzzsaw of the AL East, and the Reds play in the joke might be a strong word, but the weak in the L Central. Let's call it that.
You could say like the 2022 O's and 2023 Reds, talent-wise, could be very similar, but competition-wise, it's vastly different. I mean, the AL East last year wasn't as good as it is this season because the Red Sox were, I think, more of a disaster last year. Right. But you can still say all 5 teams last year were trying to get to the playoffs. Yes. I don't see that being the case in the NL Central. Now, maybe some of them are just falling backwards into being close to the playoffs because of how the division is set up right now. Yeah. But the Reds have an opportunity that the Orioles of 2022 didn't have. The two big differences are the opportunity, and the Reds just have more young pitching that's here in the rotation than the Orioles did last year. But generally, they have this opportunity that I wish the O's had last season, in that the Orioles won 83 games last year. The Reds can easily win this division with 83 wins. I think that's the huge difference.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to take 90. I don't even know that it'll take 88. I'm with you. I think like 83, 84, 85 probably wins the NL Central. And the more and more that I watch baseball this season, just of other teams, the more and more I look at this and I say the playoffs for both leagues are going to be chock full of West and East division teams, and then whoever doesn't lose the 2 Central divisions. Yeah. Like, there's no wild card teams coming out of either AL or NL Central side. So I love what I'm seeing from that regard. It's like the perfect storm for this Reds team, because we had also said we're looking at this rebuild. We're looking at how Nick Krall had kind of traded away a lot of guys that obviously surprised, shocked, and really kind of appalled a lot of fans. But he saw the future. He saw where he was going. He wanted it to be quick. And the more and more that we saw, we said, okay, maybe 2024 we start to open that window. Never imagined that 2023 would be that way. But something else, and a great similarity between the two sides this year that we saw on full display in all three games, is that neither team wants to quit. And no matter how late in the ball game that it is, like, I fully expected there in the bottom of the 10th inning, because knowing that the Reds were going to have to really dig deep in their bullpen, I fully expected that the Orioles might come back there too. It's just the way that both these teams are built, and that coming into Wednesday's game, both teams had the same amount of comeback wins leading their respective leagues. It's been amazing to watch. I think you and I will both possibly need to see a heart doctor at the end of this season, but it's definitely been a lot of fun.
Yeah, I will say, if that ball from Cruz doesn't somehow hit the knob of Aaron Hicks's bat on 3-1, I was almost convinced we were going to the 11th inning.
Yeah.
Like, he was nowhere near the zone. And I think that being a strike kind of refocused him in that 10th inning, just getting to reset the review, standing there, realizing, hey, I got away with one. And he threw a really good splitter after that to strike out Hicks. But if they load the bases there with Jordan Westburg coming up, who's been swinging it so well, and then you get back to the top of the Orioles order, because you'd have Frazier next, who just tied the game. Then you get to the top with Mullins. I was convinced if that either hit his finger or just didn't hit the knob of the bat, they were going to tie the game. That's how crazy this series was.
And he did his job too. Like, there was a lot of folks on Reds Twitter that are just like, boy, he looks bad, doesn't he? I'm like, he did his job. Like, he sold it. He, like, give me the trainer out here. This totally hit my hand. I'm on first. That wasn't a foul ball. And it confused everybody to the point that we thought, oh my gosh, David Bell is challenging a third call. But then we're like, no, it's because the umpire called it a foul ball. And then the Orioles had to challenge and make sure that it didn't actually hit him. I find it fascinating, because there's so many different challenge plays that I've seen this year that I'm like, man, do we really have to challenge it? But something like that, like, could have been so huge, however they called it on the field. And it's just kind of underscores the way this series has gone for the Reds from a bullpen standpoint. I mean, we saw the great bullpen arms that Baltimore has between Cano and Bautista. Still no idea how Nick Senzel bunted that one. 102 coming right at him. But that took some, as John Sadak said on the TV broadcast, some crab cakes to do. But when you look at those different guys, they were just so dominant and they look so good. And the Reds relief pitchers largely, I mean, they got the job done, but largely kind of limped through their appearances, showing lots and lots of fatigue. Kind of like you said about the 2022 Orioles, that's something you guys watched. When can we expect the legs to fall out from underneath our relief pitchers?
Yeah, I would say one thing, the Orioles bullpen up and down 1 through 8, probably better last year than the Reds bullpen is this year. I think they had some guys who in the middle relief core were better, like Alexis Diaz versus Felix Bautista, just kind of flip a coin right there. Like, both those guys are absolutely dominant. And shout out to Buck Farmer. When he pitched against the Orioles last year in Cincinnati, he was horrible. Yeah. And granted, he was pretty bad last night too, but in general, I know he's been pretty good this year as one of their setup guys. And they've fixed Alex Young at least a little bit to make him a serviceable major league pitcher. Like, they've done a good job. I mentioned Ian Jabot was like the only guy who really did impress me out of all of them. Like, he came in and just 1, 2, 3, we'll see you later. But the one thing that happened to the Orioles is Bautista started to hit the wall. And that is what really snowballed it. Now, the Orioles bullpen was starting to hit that wall kind of in late August. That's right around when they were still playing good baseball, but they were really in it. And guys just started to tire out. And one thing that's similar to the Reds is they had a lot of relievers who were having career years. That is why the bullpen was so good. And the other thing was not only career years, a lot of guys who had never spent an entire season in a big league bullpen. Like, you had guys like Brian Baker, who was awesome down the stretch last year, but he had pitched in 1 game in the big leagues before 2022. That was it. And then he spent the whole year in the bullpen. Joey Crable was a journeyman reliever with the Rays. All of a sudden, he's in the bullpen all year. he got optioned in September because he was just so bad down the stretch because everything fell apart. And we haven't seen him back in the big league since then. So some guys you have to really roll through. And really the cherry on top was Bautista. In about mid-September, he just hit a wall and he ended up going on the injured list. It was a real injury, but if he had been used a little less, I think he could have pitched through it. It was a lower body thing. It wasn't like an arm injury or anything. And guys just started to hit that wall in September. And it was the worst time because the O's entered September 2 games out of a playoff spot. So you're right there, the thing that has gotten you to this point, and it just kind of fell off the tracks. And I don't even think it was like a talent thing. Yes, a couple of guys started to regress. It was just you had so many rookie relievers, so many journeyman relievers who had been up, down, 4A, AAA shuttle guys who now found something that clicked, and they're pitching 60, 65 times in a year for the first time ever. And your body starts to shut down at the end of the season. And that's what I worry about for the Reds this year. Was same with the O's last year. Is like even a guy like Diaz has never been in this many high leverage spots throughout an entire season. And you go down from Diaz, you get less and less talent and less experience in that bullpen. I will be really interested to see if the Reds supplement it at all to try to avoid what happened to the O's. Because the O's not only did they not add to the bullpen at the deadline last year,
That's right.
They traded Jorge Lopez away. So they made their bullpen worse at the deadline and just kept on rolling. And that obviously hurt too.
I'm going to clip that, I think, and play that in late August because we've been talking about this. Steve and I have been talking about this for like a month now because David Bell manages every game. And credit to him. I mean, he's on a contract here. He's got to earn another contract, but he kind of manages every game like it's Game 7 of the World Series. I mean, we saw yesterday Luke Weaver thankfully calmed down. I mean, the first inning was just ugh. But he calms down, retires 10 straight, then starts to allow some base runners there in the 5th. And David Bell's like, all right, we're pulling you. I'm like, I almost kind of felt like that was a situation where I wanted to see if he could pitch through it because he's just been a guy that the more and more I watch him, the more and more I think that he's not the guy. And I think that it's time to move on from him. But more than that, there's a value in saving the bullpen. Like we talked about a couple of guys that came up in nights before, like Jake Wong and guys like that who pitched that were just like, this guy's not going to be here very long. But he gave the Reds 3 innings, and that was 3 innings that they didn't have to use anybody else. And they're going to have to look forward to some things like that. But speaking of look forward, I want to look forward here in just a minute and see what our two teams might do around the trade deadline. But before we do that, I want to look back because now that baseball has these balanced schedules and you get to play everybody at least once throughout the season in one series, home or away, we're going to see more of the Reds at Camden Yards. But up until this season, the Reds hadn't been to Camden Yards since 2014. And like I said, both of our teams have been through prolonged rebuilds or rebuilds off of rebuilds or builds that didn't actually happen, so they had to build it up again. Anyway, it's been a long time. In 2014, these were what the lineups looked like. You had Nick Markakis leading off for the Orioles. You had Jason Borgio leading off for the Reds, and I'm pretty sure I pronounced that right, because I never knew how to pronounce it whenever he was here. But looking at the lineups for both teams, and obviously I know you're going to look back in very fondness with Adam Jones, and your JJ Hardy and Chris Davis and guys like that. I think that was still when Chris Davis wasn't striking out 400% of the time.
That was an interesting Chris Davis year, 2014.
Yeah, he had a fall out there. But just looking back at this lineup, so there is, and burying the lead here, the Reds got swept in this series against the Orioles in Camden Yards. Orioles won the final game 9-7 with a cast of pitchers that included Chris Tillman for the Orioles starting, Mike Leake for the Reds starting. Like, looking back on this kind of a team is so much fun.
Yeah, and I know it's different for both these teams because this is the last time the Orioles won the AL East. This is 2014. This is 96 win Orioles. This goes to the ALCS team. And you're even looking at a lineup that wasn't as good as it was to start the year. You're looking at why is Kelly Johnson starting at third base? Why is Alejandro De Aza hitting second, playing left field? Well, the Orioles lost Manny Machado and Matt Wieters before this series for season-long injuries, and they really missed those guys. that year and was one of the reasons they didn't get over the hump and into the World Series in 14. But if I remember correctly, I believe Miguel Gonzalez threw a complete game in this series for the Orioles. I may have to look back at the box scores for one of the other games. Just looking at this, I mean, Nick Hundley with 3 RBIs is awesome. They traded for him from San Diego after Wieters went down with the injury early in that year, and Hundley just kind of became their starting catcher for the rest of the season. I mean, quite a journeyman he was. Nelson Cruz in his 1 year in Baltimore when he led the league in homers, and then the O's said, "You're too old to get a 4-year contract," and 9 years later, he's still in the big leagues. So that's always a good one. But yeah, this is definitely fond memories. Looking at the Red side, though, I mean, besides Todd Frazier, what's going on here?
Yeah, and the fact that Devin Mesoraco was 4 for 4 in this game with 4 RBIs and just didn't get any help. Like Todd Frazier had no for. You had Jason Borgio and Ramon Santiago batting 1-2. I don't think if you'd have asked any sort of trivia question ever that I would have ever guessed that Ramon Santiago batted in the top third of the Reds order, but here we are. Donald Lutz, he did have an RBI in this game where he I think this was actually the thing that caused Tillman to lose the win, because Chris Tillman pitched a quality start in this, 6 innings and 3 runs allowed. And then they brought in Brad Brock. Brad Brock blew up, and then it was Tommy Hunter, and Donald Lutz against Tommy Hunter came through and tied the game. But then, of course, the Reds bullpen from that point continued to blow up, because that was Manny Parra who got the loss for the Reds. And the final 2 pitchers are just peak. Now, I did like Sam LeCure, and Sam LeCure's on the broadcast now for the Reds in the pre and the post game. But Jumbo Diaz.
Nice.
A lot of Reds fans remember Jumbo Diaz, and not really for good reasons, but he's a guy that was on this team. It's just amazing to look back and see this. And you are right. I did look at the box. It was the game before this that Miguel Gonzalez pitched a complete game shutout. And actually, I mean, yeah, it was that final game there. I think it was September 4th is what I marked down on my notes. But September 4th, that was the 82nd win of the season for the Orioles. And the Reds at this point were 66 and 74. So it was 2 totally different teams in that year.
With that lineup, that's pretty impressive that they were only 8 games under 500. Right. But that was pretty close. That was about a week or 10, I believe, like 10 days before the Orioles clinched the division that year. Because not only did they win 96 games, the rest of the East was pretty bad that year. The Orioles clinched in like mid-September, which was awesome. And that was back when they still had 40-man rosters in September. So you want to talk about lineups? Some of the guys that the O's were throwing out there the last 2 weeks of the year after they had clinched the division, it was hilarious. The guys that they were getting at bats just to, keep guys healthy, keep arms healthy as well. Like the guys they were bringing out of the bullpen. That was a fun time, those last 2 weeks of that year. But yeah, that was definitely a fun Oriole year.
Seeing, and just to look back, the Miguel Gonzalez complete game shutout, the lineup for that game for the Reds was much better. Billy Hamilton led off. Frazier batted second. You had Brandon Phillips still on the team, Jay Bruce, Ryan Ludwig. So that was so when you look at that lineup, you almost say, boy, that team was that far under 500. But that's when the Reds were really starting to hit that point of, we need to hit the reset button. And they just refused to for the next year because like, well, we got the All-Star game in 2015. We're not going to hit the reset button before we do that. And so that started a whole process that led us to the point where Nick Kroll had to kill everything and trade guys away. And that's why we are where we are, and why we're hoping that this window really is opening for the Reds. And as we move forward, do you see the Orioles making a lot of moves at the trade deadline?
A lot of moves? No. Moves, yes. Big moves? Also no. That is kind of how I see the Orioles. I think they'll add to the margins of the roster, just like they did this offseason. I'd love to see the splash for an ace. I just don't think it's going to happen, to be honest.
Yeah, that's where I am. There's a lot of people saying, let's go get Shane Bieber. Let's go get Eduardo Rodriguez or something like that. I'm like, it's going to cost too much, and there's no reason. And I think the Orioles are in the same boat when it comes to the explanation as to why. There's no reason to trade your top prospects who are so close to the major leagues to go get a rental. Like, you're going to have this talent for years and years to come. No reason to mortgage it now.
Yeah, and for the O's, it'll be interesting because, can they argue that okay, we've fixed Grayson Rodriguez again. We're going to bring him back up from AAA for a second time. That's the starter we add. We're going to get John Means back, in August or September. Is that another starter we add? Yeah, maybe those arguments come. Maybe they add like a number 4 or 5 guy to just shore up the back end of the rotation. I honestly, Jeff, if I had to make a prediction, I think the Orioles will add like a really solid middle reliever at the deadline. Just a guy who can like be a veteran. Michael Givens and Dylan Tate have been on the injured list all year. Those are supposed to be their 2 veteran relievers. They're both have now started and ended rehab assignments twice without getting back to the big leagues. They keep piling up the injuries. I don't think they're going to come back this season. Jeez. So I think they need a similar guy to one of those 2 names to just be the kind of settling veteran in the pen. And then I can see like it's not going to be a Shane Bieber or a Corbin Burns or whomever. I can see like I don't even know what name it would be because it's tough to like parse out who a 4 or 5 starter that would be available would be a guy that they would add. But that's kind of what I see them doing, is just adding to the back of the rotation, adding a bullpen piece and promoting their prospects from within and just continuing on.
I could see the Orioles being in the market for Lance Lynn as well. I was looking at Lance Lynn being the kind of guy that I think the Reds should go after. Like, his underlying stats say he's been very unlucky and he's only got a little bit left on his deal, and I doubt that the White Sox are going to ask a ton for him. They just want to get something at this point. So, yeah, that's probably going to be a reason. Like, and as much as I want the Reds to make a move, they're in the same spot. Like, there's a lot of guys that they just need to figure out if they're going to be part of this team for the future. And so we kind of got to grin and bear it a little bit with guys like Brandon Williamson, that he's got the talent. It's just he hasn't shown it yet, at least on a consistent basis. And I don't know, like, Luke Weaver's not the guy, but you're going to call up somebody probably in Connor Phillips or Christian Rowe or something like that. Maybe not Christian Rowe, but yeah, there's lots to figure out with this team. It's not a finished product by any stretch of the imagination, yet here we are in first place. Go figure. It's a crazy time to be a Reds fan. It's a crazy time to be an Orioles fan, but both teams have their sights set on the postseason this year, which is fun to say.
Yeah, it feels good. The Reds at least have been there recently-ish. I know 2020 season was Mickey Mouse ball, but they got to play postseason games a little more recently. The O's haven't been since 2016. That was Zach Britton never leaves the bullpen. They haven't won a postseason game or played a postseason series since 2014, since that year we put up. So it's been a little while. I'm not saying we're like Mariners fans or anything. It hasn't been 20 years, but it's been a little while. And just to see a postseason game, just to watch a postseason game. And, I've been hosting this podcast since 2020. I've never gotten to cover a postseason game for the O's. They've been terrible until the last year and a half. So that would be nice too.
I would like to cover a postseason game where the Reds score a run. I'm looking forward to that.
That too. Yeah.
We'll end the crossover today by manifesting this. We said this before the show. Reds, Orioles, World Series. I mean, you're talking about the perfect situation here that this could happen, where the Reds and the Braves in the NLCS, just amazing entertainment. It'll kill me, but it'll be amazing entertainment. You'll have Orioles, Rays in the ALCS, amazing entertainment. And then Reds, Orioles, World Series, baseball's back. Let's go.
Yeah, it's take us back to the 1970s right there. Big Red Machine and Earl Weaver's Orioles. Fast forward to 2023. Let's do it.
1970. Oof. Looking back through history, that was a bummer. I wish I would have been alive to see it. Anyway, that's how we're going to end today's crossover. Thank you, everyone, for checking out today's Locked On Reds, Locked On Orioles crossover. A little bonus content for you here on this Thursday. Off day for the Reds. I didn't see, are the Reds or the Orioles off today as well?
Off day as well, yes.
We're both relaxing. And whenever our teams are back, you can check out their every hometown pitch through SiriusXM on the SXM app. Just search the word Reds or search the word Orioles. But for Connor Newcomb and myself, this has been a Locked On Crossover. Make sure you check out our next episodes coming up. Thank you to all of our everydayers.